Our paper is about towards formal computable representation of clinical trial eligibility criteria for Alzheimer's disease. So why we do this research? Misunderstanding of eligibility criteria and inaccurate cohort identification queries can lead to deviations from the original trial recruitment target. One is certain enrolled participants may not meet the requirements as the eligibility criteria described. The second is missing potential eligible participants, which leads to lower accuracy of the trials. For example, an inclusion criterion creatinine less than 1.5 times upper limits normal leads to ambiguity on what biospecimen source the creatinine is measured from. Therefore, standardized and computable knowledge representations for eligibility criteria are needed. So our workflow is divided into 4 steps. One is acquire free text eligibility criteria. Second is to define the patterns for this eligibility criteria. The third step is construct the ontology and representation of this eligibility criteria. Fourth, we construct the queries to query the EHR data, and we made the evaluation about this. So in order to explain more accurately, I combine the methods and the results. The first step is about data source. We use the 10 phase 3 and 4 AD interventional trials and obtain their free text eligibility criteria from clinicaltrial.gov website. We excluded criteria that are not computable against the EHR data. The second step is to define patterns for this eligibility criteria. We created an allocation guideline for eligibility criteria based on the study from Jiang's work about the knowledge graph construction. That is decomposed individual criteria into fact and condition tuples. The fact tuples is subject, relation, object, which is focused on the clinical observations. The condition tuples also is a subject, relation, object. These are the constraints related to the clinical observations. So this is the table identify the criteria patterns from the 1080 trials. Is a pattern we extracted from the eligibility criteria. These patterns are categorized into demographic, diagnosis, encounter, medication, procedure, lab test, respectively. And also we combine the diagnosis and encounter diagnosis at the medication diagnosis at the demographic. For example, a criterion patient who had Parkinson's disease within the prior 5 years can be classified as a diagnosis pattern and represented as follows. Fact part is subject diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The condition is Parkinson's disease within T time before 5 years baseline. So after we extracted the patterns from the eligibility criteria, we construct the ontology to represent the eligibility criteria. Based on our analysis of the eligibility criteria patterns, we created the initial version of the computable eligibility criteria ontology. using BFO as the upper level ontology. Following best practice in ontology construction, we reused existing high quality biomedical ontologies and iteratively improved the ontological structure. We used the human phenotype ontology and the classes in existing well-known ontology, which follow the BFO. And the group of these ontologies are similar to our ontology. And we also use time event ontology. This ontology is to represent events, time points, and their relationships. So our current ontology includes 316 classes and 58 object properties. So this is the ontology representation of the patient demographics. We use the ontology terms in ontology like gender identity term, human being, patient role, to standardize the terms we used in the eligibility criteria to represent their relationships. So this is the ontology representation about encounter. And this is about procedure. This is about the diagnosis and medications, lab test. So after we construct these representations, we went into the fourth step, query construction and evaluation. We imported the ontology into Neo4j, which is a graph database platform. And according to the representations in CECO, we represented the criteria patterns as graphs in Neo4j. Imported the individual level patient data from one Florida and linked classes of CECO to the data elements in Florida. And then we evaluate the accuracy of our representations by comparing the graph query results with the results from directly applying query logic. Like in this paper, we use the pandas to the real world data. We primarily evaluated the accuracy and runtime of the queries. In the accuracy part, all graph-based queries returned the same results as the pandas-based queries, indicating query and representation accuracies. In the runtime part, we evaluate the runtime of complex study trees and simple study trees. In the complex study trees, like patients has been hospitalized or treated for suicidal behavior in the past 5 years. Graph queries are faster than pandas queries. Yeah, and then the simple study trees, like aged greater than 50 years, graph queries are slower than their pandas counterparts. So our paper still has some limitation. For example, the sample size is small. Our study is limited as we only analyze 1080 trials. Therefore, the identified patterns are still unrepresentative. So in the future work, we will select more representative and more large sample to do the construct the ontology representations. In conclusion, we summarized the eligibility criteria patterns of 1080 trials and created the CECO to standardize and run them computable through graph-based queries, use Neo4j graph database. Yes, thank you. That's all the work.